Welcome, folks. Buckle up, because if you've been wondering just how far off the rails America's culture train has gone, today's clips are your answer. We're living in a time where common sense has been declared a hate crime, and the people screaming the loudest about democracy are usually the first ones hiding behind masks and demanding everyone else shut up. It's peak clown world, where the folks who can't define what a woman is suddenly have the moral authority to redefine your city, your country, and your paycheck. Today we're looking at a fresh batch of the signature leftist lunacy, this time straight out of Tucson, Arizona, where a group of masked mystery women are launching a campaign to make the city a sanctuary for anyone and anything, except apparently law-abiding citizens. Because nothing says transparency like covering your face and refusing to give your name while trying to rewrite the rules for everyone else. So stick around, because the contradictions here are thicker than the hypocrisy at a Hollywood climate gala.
The country has been shaken with numerous executive orders and fundamental changes in the government that infringe upon the rights and well-being of every single person that resides in the United States.
The organizers went on to say that they understand that there is only so much that the city can do, and that they are trying, but they want to see those words become action. They explained the campaign is modeled after many other sanctuary cities across the country, most recently Boston, which the organizers explained is the format for the sanctuary city they are proposing, one where it's not just for immigrants, but for all marginalized communities.
We would really like to protect the rights and well-being of all marginalized communities, and under the current administration, that is all of us.
The organizers are currently trying to get over 5,000 signatures to really make it known to City Council that this is what the community wants, and they say they are already receiving a lot of support. However, Kathleen Wynne, chairman of the Pima County Republican Party, says she is hearing differently, adding that sanctuary cities are set up so that people can, quote, circumvent the law, and that law and order needs to be restored in Tucson and Pima County to ensure businesses and the community can continue to thrive.
Well, let's talk about this latest episode of Masked Morality Theater, Inc., coming to you straight from Tucson, Arizona. A campaign so ridiculous it might as well be sponsored by Acme Corporation for how cartoonish it's gotten. Because nothing says trust us quite like activists in black masks who refuse to identify themselves while telling the rest of us how to live. If irony were a renewable energy source, Tucson could power the entire Southwest off this nonsense alone. Now let's start with the opener. They say the country has been shaken with numerous executive orders and fundamental changes in the government that infringe upon the rights and well-being of every single person that resides in the United States. That's a bold statement. In fact, it's what we call a sweeping generalization, a logical fallacy where the speaker paints with a brush so broad it makes Bob Ross look like a minimalist. Every single person's rights has been infringed. That's interesting, considering that under the current administration, President Trump, in case you forgot, the average American is actually paying lower taxes, wages are starting to go up, and illegal border crossings are finally being addressed instead of treated like a humanitarian open mic night. But of course, these masked organizers aren't interested in facts, they're interested in feelings, which is why they immediately pivot to the classic rhetorical dodge, vagueness. They want to protect all marginalized communities. Sounds noble, right? Until you realize they never actually define who those marginalized communities are, how they're marginalized, or what policies are oppressing them. They throw around the word like it's seasoning, but never actually explain the recipe. It's emotional manipulation disguised as advocacy. Then they drop this gem. Under the current administration, that is all of us. Oh, really? So now everyone's marginalized. This is what we call concept inflation, where a serious term like marginalized is stretched so thin it loses all meaning. If everyone is marginalized, no one is. It's the political equivalent of handing out participation trophies at a cage match. And let's also talk about the strategic use of anonymity here. These activists refuse to show their faces or give their names, but they expect to dictate public policy and claim to represent the community. That's not activism. That's cowardice wrapped in moral arrogance. If your ideas are so righteous, why hide behind a mask? The answer is simple. They know their ideas don't hold up under scrutiny, so they hide their faces and their accountability. And let's not ignore how they conveniently exclude key context. They proudly model their campaign after Boston's sanctuary city policies, conveniently leaving out the fact that sanctuary cities like Boston have led to real measurable problems. Increased crime from repeat offenders shielded by sanctuary city policies, strain on public resources, and ironically, the marginalization of actual citizens who now have to compete for those resources. Finally, when Kathleen Wynne points out the obvious, that sanctuary cities are designed to circumvent the law, the activist's only response is to double down on the tired, empty slogan that this is what the community wants. No mention of how sanctuary policies actually work. No acknowledgement of the fact that sanctuary city policies often shield people who have committed serious crimes beyond immigration violations. Just vibes, masks, and moral superiority. In short, this entire campaign is built on a house of logical fallacies, sweeping generalizations, emotional appeals, vagueness, false equivalencies, and the deliberate omission of inconvenient facts. It's not about protecting rights. It's about creating a parallel legal system where lawlessness is excused under the guise of compassion, and they want you to buy it, all while they hide their faces and demand you trust them. Well, I don't trust these cultural Marxists, and neither should you. The end goal is to undo the fabric of society, undo the great things America stands for, and implement chaos so they can topple the system and turn this into their so-called communist utopia. It's never going to happen. Regular people like you and me should never allow this to happen. So keep your eyes open. And speaking of things that never happened, our favorite MSNBC commentator, Elie Mystal, went out to The View to share some of their collective delusion.
One of the laws you write about is playing out right now, the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, this administration is using this statute to justify the detentions and possible deportations, actually, of visa and green card holders who they seem to deem a threat to U.S. foreign policy. What do you make of the administration's use of the act? And more broadly, is Trump really setting up a First Amendment showdown, which is what Whoopi's been talking about?
Yes, absolutely. One of my premises for the book is that every law passed before the 1965 Voting Rights Act should be presumptively unconstitutional. Right? Because before the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we were functionally an apartheid country. Not everybody who lived here could vote here. So why should I give about some law that some old white man passed in the 1920s?
I think it's safe to say there's an epidemic of mental retardation festering inside the Democrat Party, because only in this delusional circus could someone seriously argue that every law passed before 1965 should be thrown out simply because, gasp, old white men wrote them. By that logic, sweetheart, we might as well just tear up the Emancipation Proclamation, repeal the 13th Amendment, and go right back to chattel slavery, because those were laws passed by, you guessed it, old white men before 1965. You can't cherry pick history just because you don't like the complexion of the people who wrote it. But let's peel back this absurdity even further. Mystal's comments on The View, a show that's basically a group therapy session for people who mistake feelings for facts, that laws before 1965 are presumptively unconstitutional because, in his words, we were an apartheid country before the Voting Rights Act. That's a cheap rhetorical trick called historical flattening. The idea that if something was imperfect, it was entirely illegitimate. It's lazy, it's dishonest, and erases the very real, painstaking progress this country made because of the legal framework those old white men established. Now let's talk about the laws before 1965. How about the Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791? That's before 1965 by, about 174 years. Should we toss out the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, due process, and the right to a fair trial too? The entire foundation of this country is rooted on the principles laid out by the founders, yes, predominantly Christian men of European descent who believed in natural rights, not because they were perfect, but because they understood the imperfection of man and built a system designed to limit government power and protect the individual. Mystal wants to pretend like American law began and ended with Jim Crow. It didn't. The genius of the Constitution wasn't that it was flawless, it's that it was self-correcting. It created the very mechanisms that made civil rights legislation possible in the first place. Without the rule of law and the Christian moral framework that informed it, there would have been no Civil Rights Act, no Voting Rights Act, and no progress whatsoever. It's the very structure of those pre-1965 laws that made the post-1965 reforms possible. Now let's talk about the sanctimonious whining about laws post-1965, because while they clutch their pearls over laws from 100 years ago, they conveniently ignore the mountain of frivolous, bloated, and often destructive laws Democrats have rammed through since then. Chief among them, the draconian environmental laws that have shackled economic development in blue states and cities. Look no further than California, where overregulation has made it nearly impossible to build affordable housing, strangled small businesses with bureaucratic red tape, and driven the cost of living through the roof, all while doing nothing meaningful to save the planet. These aren't laws rooted in justice or fairness. They're rooted in control, virtue signaling, and economic sabotage. And while we're here, let's not ignore the rhetorical sleight of hand Mistol tried to pull. He ties his entire argument to the Immigration and Nationality Act and claims the Trump administration is violating people's rights by enforcing it. What he conveniently leaves out is that the 1965 version of the act, the one he supposedly wants to protect, was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, an old white man, and it was an update to earlier immigration law written by, you guessed it, old white men. So either the entire law is illegitimate by his own standard, or he's just using selective outrage to score a cheap applause on The View. Now, clearly, this isn't about laws. It's about power, grievance, and rewriting history to justify a political agenda that's allergic to facts, hostile to responsibility, and obsessed with permanent victimhood. The truth is, the success of this country, flawed, messy, and ever-evolving, was built on the rule of law, on constitutional principles, and on the Christian belief that rights are granted by God, not the government. So maybe instead of whining about what old white men did, Mistol should take a moment to realize he's standing on the legal and cultural foundation they built, one that's allowed him to sit on national television, collect a fat paycheck, and run his mouth without a shred of historical literacy. Because without that foundation, there's no The View, there's no book tour, and no First Amendment protection to spew this Marxist nonsense in the first place. And speaking of nonsensical news, it's been obvious to anyone paying attention that the UK has completely lost its way. And you need to look no further as to why than their Prime Minister, who recently said this.
Work together, and what can we do as a society to stop and prevent young boys being dragged into this whirlpool of hatred and misogyny. And it is young boys predominantly in this particular instance. But also, how can we protect young girls that are at risk? Because obviously that's a very strong feature of the, the documentary, the drama. That again, as I say, my boy is 16, my girl is 14, so I'm seeing this very much through both sets of eyes, and that's why I think it hits hard.
What we just witnessed is an actual British Prime Minister making a sweeping, baseless generalization, demonizing young men in his country, including, hilariously, his own son, purely based on a woke teleplay produced by one of the largest left-wing propaganda machines on the planet, Netflix. You can't make this up. This is where Western leadership is at in 2025. The man who's supposed to be leading the UK is now taking public policy cues from a fictional Netflix drama written by screenwriters whose greatest qualification is a BA in gender studies and a knack for emotional manipulation. Now, let's be clear. Nowhere in Starmer's comments is there any data on violent crime. None. Not a single statistic, not a single police report, not a single empirical fact. Instead, he leans entirely on a manufactured narrative of a scripted drama called Adolescence, a show designed, written, and edited to sensationalize the worst stereotypes about young men and conveniently package it into a morality play that blames social media, masculinity, and you guessed it, the patriarchy for every problem under the sun. This is what's called a moral panic, a classic political technique where the public is distracted and manipulated into believing there's an epidemic of social decay, usually without evidence, but with plenty of carefully curated anecdotes and manufactured outrage. It's the same tired playbook used to justify censorship, government overreach, and the continued erosion of civil liberties, this time under the guise of protecting young girls from some phantom wave of incel terrorism supposedly sweeping the UK. And let's not ignore the grotesque irony here. Starmer himself admits he's watching this series with his teenage son and daughter, seeing it through both sets of eyes. Translation, he's publicly projecting his own failures as a father onto the entire male population of Britain. If your son is such a vulnerable, impressionable little lamb being radicalized by TikTok videos and Andrew Tate memes, maybe that's a parenting problem, Keir, not a national crisis. It's embarrassingly transparent. He's using his own household dysfunction as justification to pathologize an entire generation of young men. Even worse, this classic collective guilt rhetoric. Instead of addressing real criminal behavior on an individual basis, Starmer is preemptively collectively blaming all boys, branding them as potential threats simply because of their gender. Imagine the outcry if a conservative prime minister said the same thing about young women being dragged into hatred through radical feminism or misandrist influencers. The double standard here is staggering. Now, the logical fallacies here are almost too many to count. Sweeping generalization, false cause, appeal to emotion, guilt by association. There's no evidence linking the rise in violent crime in the UK to toxic masculinity or online influencers. What is linked to crime? Broken families, poverty, under-policing, unfettered immigration, and years of soft-on-crime progressive policies championed by the very party Starmer leads. But instead of addressing the systemic failures of his own government, like the knife crime epidemic in London, grooming gangs, or the collapse of public order in major cities, he's pinning the blame on boys watching too much TikTok. And let's talk about the selective outrage. Starmer is worried about young men being dragged into hatred, but strangely silent about the actual violent crime statistics in his own country. UK violent crime rates have risen steadily over the last decade, not because of Andrew Tate, but because of mass immigration policies that have overwhelmed local resources, soft sentencing, the destruction of the nuclear family, and a justice system that prioritizes criminals over victims. But sure, let's pretend a Netflix drama is a real threat. This is what happens when leadership is outsourced to virtue-signaling media narratives and champagne socialists. The people running Britain and much of the West are more interested in fighting imaginary misogynistic boogeymen than confronting real societal decay. It's easier to blame incel culture than admit that your own policies created lawless streets, fatherless homes, and skyrocketing crime. So while Starmer clutches his pearls over fictional teenage boys in a Netflix script, the real young men of Britain are being written off, demonized, and denied any positive sense of masculinity. And make no mistake, that's by design, because a generation of strong, independent, self-reliant men is the last thing these paternalistic authoritarians want. They'd much rather keep boys weak, guilty, and compliant. It's easier to control them. That's the real toxic behavior here. It's not coming from YouTube influencers. It's coming from the top of the government because they have a vested interest in controlling you and your actions. And speaking of bad takes, these comments from John Boyega about the Star Wars fanbase resurfaced, and needless to say, he goes full Rachel Zegler.
They're pandering. Let me tell you, Star Wars always had the vibe of being in the most whitest elite space. Like, this franchise is so white that it's like a black person existing in that was something. And you can always tell it's something when some Star Wars fans try to say, well, we had Lando Calrissian and had Samuel L. Jackson. It's like telling me how many cookie chips are on the cookie dough. I'm like, bro, it's just, they just scattered that in there, bro. They're okay with us playing the best friend, but once we touch their heroes, once we lead, once we trailblaze, it's like, oh my God, it's just a bit too much.
What we're watching go viral all over again is yet another resurfaced meltdown from a Hollywood millionaire who spent years nursing a grudge because fans didn't universally bow down and worship him. Not for the quality of his performance, mind you, but for his skin color. John Boyega, a man who became a household name only because of Star Wars fans, decided back then that those same fans were nothing more than white elitists who couldn't stand seeing a black man in their beloved galaxy far, far away. And now, years later, this tired, bitter rant is making the rounds again, not because it holds any truth, but because it perfectly encapsulates the narcissism and victimhood complex infecting the modern entertainment class. Let's start with a sweeping generalization that Boyega makes. He paints the entire Star Wars fanbase as white, racist, and elitist, a claim so embarrassingly reductive it wouldn't pass a freshman debate class. He ignores the fact that Star Wars has one of the most diverse global audiences in entertainment history. The franchise is beloved by millions across Asia, Africa, Latin America, hardly the demographic of white elitists. But Boyega didn't care about facts back then, and that aged like milk. Then there's a cheap rhetorical trick of moving the goalposts. He mocks fans who point out the inclusion of characters like Lando, saying it's like telling me how many cookie chips are in the cookie dough. Translation, no amount of representation is ever enough unless he's the hero, the center, the main character. This is a classic no true Scotsman fallacy. Every example of black excellence in Star Wars gets disqualified because it doesn't fit Boyega's personal standard of what representation is supposed to actually look like. And let's talk about the actual history he conveniently erases. Star Wars, from its inception, was about the universal human struggle between good and evil, something that transcends race, nationality, or gender. George Lucas wasn't casting for skin color quotas. He was casting for talent and character fit. When Billy D. Williams became an icon as Lando, it wasn't because he checked the diversity box. It was because he brought charisma and cool to the role, and fans loved him for it. Nobody cared about the color of his skin. They cared about the story. But that's the fatal flaw in Boyega's argument. He wasn't talking about storytelling or character development when he made these comments years ago. He was talking about identity politics, reducing complex characters, beloved worlds, and decades of fandom to nothing more than a racial headcount. It's the same tired progressive reductionism that assumes everything must be viewed through the lens of oppression and privilege, even in a fictional universe populated by Wookiees and droids. And let's not ignore the glaring hypocrisy here either. Boyega built his career off the back of a predominantly white Western audience who bought tickets, merchandise, and paid his salary. Yet here he was, sneering at those same people because they dared to critique the films he starred in. And let's be honest, the backlash of the Disney sequel trilogy had nothing to do with the color of the actors and everything to do with the absolute dumpster fire of the writing. Fans didn't reject Boyega's character because he's black. They rejected the incoherent, lazy storytelling that turned once great characters into bland, hollow, politically correct placeholders. Boyega was also engaging in the classic victimhood grift, a tried and true strategy in modern Hollywood where every critique, every box office failure, every fan backlash is repackaged as racism, sexism, or some form of bigotry that's new to everybody. So the actor or director never have to actually take responsibility for the awful product they created. It's much easier to say, they hate me because I'm black, than to admit that maybe, just maybe, the movies just sucked. And here's the real kicker. This divisive rhetoric doesn't empower anyone. It doesn't uplift black audiences or black actors or black directors. It doesn't create better stories. It just poisons the well, turning entertainment into a racial blame game where any criticism is framed as hate and every failure is weaponized against the very people who made these actors rich in the first place. The irony is that the Star Wars universe is supposed to be about unity, freedom, and fighting tyranny. What Boyega was promoting at that time when he first spewed this nonsense, and what's being rehashed now by people like Rachel Zegler, is the exact opposite. Division, resentment, and tribalism disguised as progress. At the end of the day, the only elitism on display here is coming from Boyega himself, a man so insulated in Hollywood privilege that he can stand on a mountain built by fans and spit on them while crying victim. And frankly, the Force deserves better. So ask yourself, how did we get here? How did we arrive at a place where millionaires lecture working class fans about oppression, where fictional dramas dictate public policy, and where self-appointed moral authorities rewrite history to fit their own fragile egos? What does this say about our culture when criticism is no longer a conversation but a crime, when disagreement is branded as hatred, and when entire groups are casually slandered because they don't clap loud enough for the latest progressive sermon? If the people in power, whether it's politicians, celebrities, or media corporations, are this desperate to control not just what you watch, but how you think and who you're allowed to criticize, maybe the real question isn't whether their narrative is true. Maybe the question is, what are they so afraid you'll figure out if you stop believing it? You tell me what you think in the comments down below. Have a terrific day. Peace.